Frequency words. In this lesson, you'll learn Japanese frequency words like always, often, sometimes, and more. Mastering these will help you talk about your daily routines, habits, and what you do sometimes or never. Let's start with the high and moderate frequency words. いつも means always. It indicates that the frequency is extremely high or close to 100%. For example, 私はいつも電車で学校に行きます。I always go to school by train. 私はいつも電車で学校に行きます。大抵 means usually. Its frequency is a bit lower than いつも but still very high. For example, 私は大抵朝にパンを食べます。I usually eat bread in the morning. 私は大抵朝にパンを食べます。よく means often. It indicates that the frequency is high, though not quite as high as 大抵。For example, 私はよく日本のドラマを見ます。I often watch Japanese dramas. 私はよく日本のドラマを見ます。時々 means sometimes. It indicates that the frequency is moderate. For example, 私は時々小説を読みます。I sometimes read novels. 私は時々小説を読みます。Next, let's cover the words that must be used with the negative form. Not much and never. To use these, the verb must be in the negative form. Therefore, you need to put ません to the end of the verb. あまり plus the negative form means not much. This suggests a low frequency. For example, 私はコーヒーをあまり飲みません。I don't drink coffee much. 私はコーヒーをあまり飲みません。全然 plus the negative form means never. For example, 私は酒を全然飲みません。I never drink alcohol. 私は酒を全然飲みません。Now, let's look at a visual representation of the nuances of each word. Of course, these are merely representations and do not strictly indicate the precise nuances of the words. The nuances of words can vary depending on the context and the individual. However, the general nuances look like this. Finally, let's look at words that express frequency by a specific time period. 毎 means every. By adding words for time period, we can make words like every day, every week, and every year. 毎日 means every day. For example, 私は 毎日日本語を勉強します。I study Japanese every day. 私は毎日日本語を勉強します。毎週 means every week. For example, 私は毎週ジョギングをします。I jog every week. 私は毎週ジョギングをします。毎年 means every year. For example, 私は毎年旅行します。I take a trip every year. 私は毎年旅行します。Today, we learned basic words for frequency. Of course, there are many other words to express frequency, but mastering these words will make it easier to learn more vocabulary later. The next lesson is から and まで from and to. See you in the next lesson. Thank you for watching.